The courtroom was unusually calm that morning. Papers shuffled softly, footsteps echoed across the marble floor, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights hung in the air. Judge Frank Caprio sat at his bench, glasses low on his nose, reading the next file in line. "Thomas Hale," he called. Pause. Then from the back row an older man rose slowly. His jacket was worn thin at the elbows, his shoes scuffed from years of work. In one hand he held a crumpled hat, in the other, a folded piece of paper he kept glancing at like it carried the weight of his soul. He made his way to the podium with the quiet dignity of someone who'd seen too much and said too little. Caprio looked up, smiling warmly. "Good morning, sir," he said, his familiar kindness filling the room. "How are you today?" The man's reply was soft, almost a whisper. "Nervous, Your Honor." His voice trembled, the kind that carried stories between the cracks. The judge chuckled gently as he often did to ease the tension. "Don't worry," he said. "This isn't the Supreme Court. We'll be kind." But what came next was not part of any routine hearing. The man adjusted his stance, swallowed hard, and looked up with tired eyes that seemed to hold back years of silence. "Your Honor," he began, voice quivering but steady enough to command attention, "I didn't come here to fight a ticket." Caprio raised his eyebrows slightly, his smile fading into curiosity. The man took a deep breath. "I came to tell you something I should have said a long time ago." The courtroom went still. The bailiff stopped moving. Even the sound of typing from the clerk's desk came to a halt. There was something in the man's tone, humility mixed with regret, that drew everyone closer without a word. Caprio leaned forward, removing his glasses. "Go ahead, Mr. Hale," he said quietly. "We're listening." Thomas looked down at his hat, twisting it slowly between his hands. "It's not about the fine," he murmured. "It's about what I've done." The judge's expression softened, unsure whether this was about guilt, pain, or something far deeper. "What do you mean?" he asked. Thomas lifted his gaze, and the tremor in his voice cracked into something raw. "I've been carrying a secret, Your Honor, and I don't know if I can keep it any longer." Every person in the courtroom leaned in. The air thickened. The gentle rhythm of a normal morning in Judge Caprio's court had vanished. Something extraordinary was unfolding, something human, fragile, and painfully real. The judge nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then tell us, Mr. Hale. What is it you need to say?" Thomas took a deep breath, his fingers tightening around the brim of his hat. "I came here," he said, eyes glistening, "because before I leave this world, I need someone to finally know the truth." The room fell silent again. No sound, no movement, just one man, a judge, and the weight of a confession that promised to change everything. Before that morning in court, Thomas Hale was just another name people passed over, another quiet figure in the background of a busy city. For nearly 40 years, he had worked the night shift as a janitor, mopping the marble floors of government buildings most people only entered once in their lives. His world began when everyone else's ended, after the lights went out, after the voices faded, after the city fell asleep. While others dreamed, he cleaned. While others chased justice, ambition, or comfort, Thomas carried a broom, a bucket, and the kind of dignity that didn't need recognition to exist. He was 64 now, his back bent from years of lifting, scrubbing, and pushing. The halls he cleaned every night were the same halls where judges like Caprio passed judgment by day. Sometimes as he emptied the courtroom trash cans, he'd glance up at the judge's bench, polished, grand, untouchable, and wonder what kind of man it took to sit there. Then he'd quietly go back to his work, humming softly to himself, the sound echoing through the still corridors like a song only the walls ever heard. Thomas lived alone in a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of Providence, its peeling paint and flickering hallway light a silent reflection of his life, modest, unassuming, functional. His wife, Mary, had passed away 9 years earlier after a long battle with cancer. Since then, the apartment had felt like a museum of her absence. A single framed photograph sat by his bedside, Mary smiling, holding their daughter Lily when she was just a baby. Lily had been born with a neurological condition that made daily life a struggle. Now in her 30s, she lived in an assisted care facility across town. Thomas visited her every Sunday, rain or shine, bringing fresh flowers and her favorite oatmeal cookies. He never missed a week. His small paycheck stretched thin, but somehow he always found enough to make her smile. Most of what he earned cleaning floors went straight to her care. "She's my reason," he'd tell anyone who asked. "You take away the reason and you take away the man." The ticket that brought him before Judge Caprio that morning wasn't unusual or dramatic, just a parking violation outside the hospital. He had stopped for a few minutes too long after visiting Lily, sitting in his car, watching her wave from the window before she disappeared behind the curtains. He hadn't noticed the meter blinking red. When the citation arrived in the mail, he sighed, tucked it into his worn jacket pocket and kept working. He'd been in that courtroom countless times as a cleaner, but never as a defendant. To the world, he was invisible, the man who made the floors shine and vanished before dawn. But beneath the quiet routine, beneath the tired eyes and calloused hands, Thomas carried something the world had forgotten to look for, a heart that gave more than it ever received, and a secret that was about to shake the foundation of that very courtroom. Judge Caprio adjusted his glasses and looked over the paperwork in front of him. "Mr. Hale," he said kindly, "I see here this parking violation is from the hospital lot on Elm Street. You've worked for the city for quite some time, haven't you?" Thomas nodded, his rough hands folded together on the podium. "Yes, sir. Since I was 24. Caprio smiled faintly. "That's a long time to serve the same city. I imagine you've seen every kind of mess a person can make." A few quiet laughs rippled through the room, but Thomas didn't smile. His eyes stayed down. Caprio's tone softened. "You've never been in front of me before, Mr. Hale. So tell me why today. Why not just mail in the fine like everyone else?" Thomas hesitated, his fingers gripping the edge of the stand. "Because I couldn't pay it." The courtroom grew still. The answer was so simple, yet the way he said it carried weight, not shame but exhaustion. Caprio tilted his head, thoughtful. "Couldn't pay it?" he repeated gently. "Or didn't want to?" Thomas lifted his gaze, his voice calm but fragile. "Couldn't, Your Honor. Not because I don't care, but because I've been sending what little I have somewhere else." The judge frowned slightly. "Somewhere else?" Thomas nodded, his voice almost trembling now. "Yes, sir. To other people. Strangers mostly." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Caprio leaned forward, confused. "You've been sending money to strangers? Why would you do that?" Thomas took a breath, glancing down at the old hat in his hands. "Because sometimes," he said softly, "people just need a little help. And I figured if I could make their day a little easier, maybe that'd be enough for me." The judge blinked, unsure he'd heard correctly. "Mr. Hale, are you saying you've been giving away your money to pay other people's fines?" A faint, sad smile crossed Thomas's face. "Not giving away exactly. Just helping where I could. You've got that payment drop box by the clerk's office. Every month or so, when I'd sweep there at night, I'd leave a few bills in an envelope. I'd see names on the unpaid slips left behind, single moms, veterans, kids who looked scared on the docket list. I'd just write a note that said, 'Paid in full.' Then I'd go back to work." The silence that followed was thick enough to feel. The bailiff looked at the judge, unsure what to do. The audience stared, processing what they'd just heard. Caprio leaned back slowly, taking off his glasses. "How long have you been doing this, Mr. Hale?" Thomas looked up, his voice quiet but steady. "About 15 years now, give or take. Started small. 20 here, 30 there. Never much, just what I could spare." Caprio exhaled, visibly moved. 15 years, and you never told anyone?" Thomas shook his head. "Didn't see the point, sir. Wasn't about being thanked. I just figured someone ought to help those who can't catch a break." The room was utterly silent. The man who cleaned the courthouse floors for decades had been secretly paying the fines of those who walked across them, quietly, anonymously, faithfully. Judge Caprio rested his hands on the bench, his voice trembling slightly as he spoke. "Mr. Hale, do you understand what you've done?" Thomas nodded, eyes glistening. "Yes, Your Honor. I broke no law. I just wanted to remind the world there's still kindness left, even in small corners." And in that moment, every heart in that courtroom realized they were in the presence not of a man begging for mercy, but of one quietly rewriting what mercy meant. Judge Caprio sat back for a moment, his usual composure wavering as the weight of Thomas's quiet confession settled over the courtroom. For a long time no one spoke. Then softly Caprio said, "Mr. Hale, may I ask you something?" Thomas nodded, his fingers still wrapped around his hat like it was the only thing keeping him steady. "Why?" Caprio's voice was gentle but searching. "Why keep doing this for so long? You could have used that money for yourself, for your daughter. You've given so much, for people you don't even know." Thomas stared down for a moment, his eyes distant, lost somewhere far beyond the courtroom walls. When he finally spoke, his words came slowly, each one heavy with memory. "Because I know what it feels like to lose everything over something small." Caprio tilted his head slightly, his expression softening. "What do you mean?" Thomas looked up, and for the first time that morning his voice cracked. "It was 20 years ago, Your Honor. My wife, Mary, she got a parking ticket. Just a simple one. She parked outside the emergency room because our little girl, Lily, she couldn't breathe. It was her asthma again, only worse this time." He swallowed hard, eyes glistening. Mary was scared. She ran inside, carrying Lily in her arms, yelling for help. When she came back out, there was a ticket on the windshield. The courtroom went completely still. Thomas's gaze dropped to his hands. I remember her laughing about it later, trying to make me feel better. She said, "It's just a piece of paper, Tommy. We'll handle it." But that night, she never made it home. Heart attack. His voice trembled. Doctors said it was the stress. Said it could have happened anytime. But I always wondered, what if it was that moment? What if that ticket, that one tiny thing, pushed her too far? Caprio blinked, his throat tightening. The clerk looked down, dabbing her eyes. The air in the room felt heavy, sacred. Thomas took a shaky breath. After that, I kept seeing people come through this courthouse. Mothers, fathers, people just trying to make it through the day. Crying over fines they couldn't pay. It broke something in me every time. I'd sweep up after they left, find their papers on the floor, and I'd see that same panic in the ink. That same fear I saw in Mary's eyes. He paused, voice nearly a whisper now. So one night I decided to pay one. Just one. Didn't tell anyone. Didn't want credit. I just thought, maybe if someone walked out of here feeling lighter, maybe the world wouldn't take from them what it took from me. The judge removed his glasses, setting them gently on the bench. His voice was soft, almost reverent. "You've been carrying that pain all these years." Thomas nodded, tears finally escaping down his cheeks. "I couldn't save her that day," he said, voice breaking, "but maybe I can save someone else a little bit of pain. Maybe that's how I make peace with it." The entire courtroom was silent. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to vanish. The bailiff looked away, swallowing hard. Thomas wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "I know it's not much. It doesn't change what happened. But every time I drop an envelope in that box, I feel like I'm telling her I'm sorry. For not being there. For not protecting her. For letting something so small become something so big." Caprio leaned forward, his own voice thick with emotion. "Mr. Hale," he said quietly, "you've done more good in silence than most people do in a lifetime of noise." Thomas smiled faintly, the kind of smile that came not from happiness but from release. "I guess this is my way of saying sorry, Your Honor." And in that moment, the courtroom didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. It felt like a chapel, a place where one man's grief turned into grace, and where even justice itself stood still long enough to listen. For several long seconds no one moved. The courtroom, a place usually filled with chatter, shuffling papers and distant echoes, had fallen into a silence that felt sacred. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, his eyes glassy, his lips pressed together as if he were holding back the weight of everything he'd just heard. Finally he exhaled slowly, took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Mr. Hale," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I've been on this bench for many years. I've seen anger, I've seen lies, I've seen pain, but I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like you." Thomas stood quietly at the podium, head bowed, hat still in hand. He looked like a man who'd spent his entire life avoiding the spotlight, now forced to stand beneath it. Caprio looked down at the ticket in front of him, then back at Thomas. "You know," he said softly, "the law was created to bring fairness. But sometimes, the law meets someone whose heart goes beyond fairness. Someone who reminds us what mercy really looks like." He paused, voice thick with emotion. "You've paid more than enough fines in your life, Mr. Hale, and none of them were yours." The audience stirred, some whispering, others already wiping their eyes. Caprio lifted his gavel, he said, then stopped himself. "People just need a little help," he said quietly, "and I figured if I could make their day a little easier, he set the gavel down gently, not with the usual authority, unsure he'd heard correctly. As if Mr. Hale, justice itself needed to bow its head. "You've been giving away your money to pay other people's fines?" The judge leaned forward again, looking out at the courtroom. Thomas's face. "Before we move on, not giving away exactly, I want to ask everyone here to do something. You've got that payment drop box by the clerk's office. As the judge stood up from his bench, when I'd sweep there at night, rarely did. I'd leave a few bills in an envelope," he said, voice breaking slightly. "I'd see names on the unpaid slips left behind. The bailiff rose single moms, veterans, clerk, and then one by one the entire courtroom followed. I just write a note that said students, paid in full. Every soul in the room rising in a wave of gratitude. The silence that followed rustling chairs filled the space as dozens of people stood judge, unsure what to do. Fixed on the humble man at the podium, processing what they just directly at Thomas. Caprio leaned back slowly, taking off his glasses. courtroom stands for you. How long have you been doing this, for the love you've given in silence? Thomas looked up. Every stranger who will never know your name but has felt your kindness. About 15 years now, Thomas's lips trembled. Started small. Your Honor. 20 here, I don't know what to say. Never Caprio much, smiled just what I could spare. You've already exhaled, visibly moved. Then turning to his clerk, he motioned gently. And you never told anyone? Bring me the donation Thomas fund shook jar, his head. Please. Didn't see the clerk point, looked sir. Puzzled, but it wasn't about placing the small collection jar. I just figured someone ought to help those who can't catch a break. On the bench, the room was Caprio reached silent. Into his own wallet. The man who pulled out the courthouse floors for decades had been secretly paying the fines of those who walked across them. He said softly, quietly, from all the people you helped who never got the chance to thank you. Judge Caprio rested his hands on the bench, quiet chain reaction. His voice trembling slightly as he spoke. People in the courtroom began stepping forward. Do you understand what you've done? Lawyers, strangers, Thomas nodded, placing bills, coins, even handwritten notes onto the bench. I broke no law. Some whispered, I just wanted to remind the world others simply nodded at Thomas as they walked even in past. Small corners. Within minutes, and in that the table moment, was covered. Every heart in Thomas that courtroom realized they were in the presence not of a man begging for mercy, shaking as he whispered, one quietly I was never looking for thanks, Your Honor. Judge Caprio sat back for a moment, voice gentle his usual but steady. Composure wavering as the weight of Thomas's quiet confession. The courtroom erupted into quiet applause. For a long time, no one spoke, not for show, but the kind that came from the soul. Mr. Hale, and for the first time in his life, Thomas Hale, the man who cleaned other people's messes, wrapped around his hat like it was the only thing keeping him steady. For what he truly was. Caprio's voice was gentle kept the world a little cleaner. Why keep doing this for so long? You could have used that money for yourself, for your daughter. Within days, given local news stations for people you don't even know. Judge Caprio's courtroom. Thomas stared down the humble janitor whose secret generosity had brought somewhere far beyond the courtroom walls. The headline when he finally spoke, his words came slowly to tears. Each one heavy with national outlets picked it up. Because I know what it feels like to lose the country over something small. The trembling man with the old jacket, the judge rising to his expression softened. The crowd standing in applause. What do you mean? Something about it pierced through the noise of everyday life. His voice cracked. It wasn't about money. It was 20 years ago. It wasn't even about the law. My wife, it was about the kind of goodness that exists quietly, just a simple one. The kind that never asked to be outside the emergency room because our arriving at the courthouse. Lily, she couldn't breathe. Simply to it was her asthma again, only worse this time. Envelopes came filled with small donations, handwritten notes, and Mary was scared. She ran in single mother carrying Lily in her arms, yelling for help. Now we're paying it forward. When she came back out, there was a ticket on the windshield. Once invisible, the courtroom became the heart of the movement. Thomas's donations poured in hands, enough to help him. I remember her laughing about it later, trying to make me feel better. But when a reporter asked how he felt about becoming a national symbol of kindness, but Thomas just smiled. She never made it home. I didn't mean to start anything. His voice trembled. I just didn't want anyone to feel forgotten. Said it could have happened anytime. In a later interview, but I always wondered on that day, what if it was that the day that transformed not just the courtroom but every one tiny thing. His words carried the same tenderness that filled the room that morning. The clerk spent his life dabbing his courthouse. The air in the room felt heavy, but in the end, he Thomas took a shaky breath. Our hearts. After that, I kept seeing people come through this court again, touching millions more. Fathers, people just began sharing their own acts of kindness over fines they couldn't pay. Some paid off strangers' grocery bills. Others donated to hospitals and shelters in Thomas's name, and I'd see that same panic was even placed in the courthouse lobby. That same fear I saw in Mary's eyes. That read, in honor of Thomas Hale, whisper proof that mercy needs no title. So one night I decided to pay one. As the camera fades to the narrator's closing words, didn't tell anyone. The tone softens into one of gratitude and quiet awe. Maybe if someone walked out of here reminded the world that real wealth isn't counted in dollars but in decency. The judge removed his glasses, given freely, setting them gently on the bench. Yet changes everything. His voice was soft, the music fades, and the screen turns to black. You've been carrying that pain all these years. Then in simple white text, the message appears. Tears finally escaping down his cheeks. Friends, if the story touched your heart, share it. I couldn't save her that day. Sometimes the poorest souls carry the richest hearts. But maybe I can save someone else a little bit of pain as the outro begins. Maybe that's how I make peace with it. In our next story, the entire courtroom was silent. Leaves Judge Caprio. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to vanish. The bailiff looked away, swallowing hard. Thomas wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve. I know it's not much. It doesn't change what happened. But every time I drop an envelope in that box, I feel like I'm telling her I'm sorry. For not being there. For not protecting her. For letting something so small become something so big. Caprio leaned forward, his own voice thick with emotion. Mr. Hale, he said quietly, you've done more good in silence than most people do in a lifetime of noise. Thomas smiled faintly, the kind of smile that came not from happiness but from release. I guess this is my way of saying sorry, Your Honor. And in that moment, the courtroom didn't feel like a courtroom anymore. It felt like a chapel, a place where one man's grief turned into grace, and where even justice itself stood still long enough to listen. For several long seconds, no one moved. The courtroom, a place usually filled with chatter, shuffling papers, and distant echoes, had fallen into a silence that felt sacred. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, his eyes glassy, his lips pressed together as if he were holding back the weight of everything he'd just heard. Finally he exhaled slowly, took off his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "Mr. Hale," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "I've been on this bench for many years. I've seen anger, I've seen lies, I've seen pain, but I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like you." Thomas stood quietly at the podium, head bowed, hat still in hand. He looked like a man who'd spent his entire life avoiding the spotlight, now forced to stand beneath it. Caprio looked down at the ticket in front of him, then back at Thomas. "You know," he said softly, "the law was created to bring fairness. But sometimes, the law meets someone whose heart goes beyond fairness, someone who reminds us what mercy really looks like." He paused, voice thick with emotion. "You've paid more than enough fines in your life, Mr. Hale, and none of them were yours." The audience stirred, some whispering, others already wiping their eyes.